The cold in my kitchen that morning wasn't from the November frost on the windows. It was from her voice. My daughter-in-law sat across from me at the table. My wife Eleanor had picked out 41 years ago, and she told me, with the kind of smile you'd give a child you were lying to, that the lake house in Muskoka was really too much for me to maintain anymore. She slid a brochure across the wood, a retirement residence in Mississauga, Brookhaven Manor. The photo on the front showed an elderly couple holding hands by a fountain, both of them smiling like they'd been sedated. I stared at that brochure for a long time. The kettle was still whistling. I'd forgotten about it. My name is Henry McAllister. I'm 68 years old. I worked 36 years as a structural engineer, mostly on bridges, the last 11 of those as a partner at a firm in downtown Toronto, before I sold my share back to the others in 2019. Eleanor and I had one son, Thomas. Eleanor passed in March, 8 months before that morning at the kitchen table. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the funeral. There are mornings even now where I wake up and reach across the bed before I remember. The estate Eleanor left behind was substantial. Her father had been one of the original investors in a mining venture up in Sudbury back in the 70s, and when he died in 1998, Eleanor inherited the trust. She'd let it grow. She didn't touch it. She was a kindergarten teacher for 31 years, and she drove the same Subaru until 2014. The trust, when she passed, was worth just over 95 million Canadian dollars. The lake house. The cottage on Lake of Bays. The condo in Yorkville. The portfolios at RBC and BMO. Every bit of it. And our son Thomas's wife, Caroline, the woman now sliding a brochure for a Mississauga retirement home across my kitchen table, had decided that none of it was going to me. "Henry, we just want what's best for you," she said. She was 34. She had a way of tilting her head when she lied. Thomas and I had been talking, and the lake house, the maintenance, the property taxes, it's just too much for one person. We think it's time. I picked up the kettle. I poured my tea. My hands didn't shake. That surprised me looking back. I'd expected my hands to shake. "Where's Thomas?" I asked. He's at work. He asked me to come talk to you. He thought it would be easier. That was the word she used. I want to be honest about my son before I go any further, because if I make him sound like a villain, that's not the truth. Thomas is a good man who married a woman with a sharper appetite than his own, and he never had the spine to stand up to her. He's an accountant at a mid-sized firm on Bay Street, makes a decent living. But Caroline came from a family in Oakville with money that wasn't quite as much as they pretended it was, and she'd spent the entire decade of her marriage to my son trying to upgrade. New car every 3 years, a house in Forest Hill they couldn't really afford. 2 children, my grandchildren, Aiden and Sophie, 10 and 7, who I love more than I know how to say. After Eleanor's funeral, Caroline started coming around. At first I thought it was kindness. She'd bring casseroles I didn't eat. She'd organize my mail. She'd suggest I let her help with some of the paperwork. Within 6 weeks, she had power of attorney forms on the kitchen table. Within 10 weeks, she was talking to her cousin who worked at a real estate agency about options for the lake house. By August, she'd taken Eleanor's wedding ring off the dresser in my bedroom and put it in a safety deposit box for safekeeping, she said, though the box was at her bank, not mine. I noticed all of it. I just didn't say anything. Eleanor used to tell me that my worst quality and my best quality were the same thing, which was that I watched. I watched, and I waited, and I let people show me who they were before I made up my mind. Caroline showed me who she was the morning of the brochure after she left. I sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours. The tea got cold. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about what she'd said to me in the hospital. 3 days before the end, when she could barely speak, she'd squeezed my hand and she'd said, "Don't let them push you around, Henry." I thought she meant the doctors. I understood now that she'd meant something larger. I called Margaret Whitfield that afternoon. Margaret was Eleanor's lawyer. She'd been Eleanor's lawyer for almost 20 years. She was 61, had practiced estate law in Toronto since the late 80s, and she was, hands down, one of the most ferocious people I have ever met in my life. She and Eleanor had become friends through work. Margaret had handled Eleanor's father's estate when he died, and she'd handled Eleanor's trust ever since. The two of them used to have lunch every 6 weeks at a place on Yonge Street that did a good split pea soup. Margaret had cried at Eleanor's funeral. Not the polite kind of crying, the real kind. "Henry," she said when I told her about the brochure. There was a long pause on the line. "How long has this been going on?" "Months." "Why didn't you call me sooner?" "Because I wanted to be sure." Another long pause. Then she said, "Are you sure now?" "Yes. Come down to the office tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. Bring everything. Every document, every email, every voicemail she's left you. Everything you have." I brought it all in a banker's box. Margaret went through the box for 90 minutes without speaking. When she was done, she leaned back in her chair and she looked at me. And she said, "Henry, what do you want?" I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. "I want her to think she's won," I said. "All the way to the end, I want her to walk into the reading of Eleanor's will absolutely certain that she's about to get everything. And then I want her to find out, in front of her husband and her in-laws and the lawyer she's never met, exactly what she's actually inherited." Margaret smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "That can be arranged," she said. "What we did over the next 4 months was something I'm still not entirely proud of, though I'm not entirely ashamed either. It existed in a place I hadn't known existed before. Margaret called it letting the rope out. I let the rope out, and Caroline ran with it. I started forgetting things, on purpose. Small things at first. I'd call Caroline by her sister's name. I'd ask Thomas the same question twice in one phone call. I'd leave the stove on, just the back burner, just for a few minutes, until Caroline noticed it during her weekly check-in visits. I went to my GP, Dr. Chen, who'd been my doctor for 22 years, and I told him exactly what was happening. He listened. He took notes. He performed a full cognitive assessment. The results were clear. There was nothing wrong with me. He documented it carefully. He filed the report in a place where Caroline's hired specialists, when they came, would not find it. Because they came. Of course they came. By January, Caroline had arranged for a geriatric specialist she'd found through a friend to come do an in-home assessment. I performed for that specialist the way an actor performs on opening night. I was confused about the date. I asked the specialist if she was the woman from the bank. I forgot the name of the current prime minister, then corrected myself, then forgot it again. The specialist wrote a report. Caroline got a copy. I got a copy too, eventually, through Margaret, who'd quietly arranged for the specialist's findings to be cross-referenced with my actual medical records. Margaret kept everything, every document, every assessment, every email Caroline sent to her cousin in real estate, every voicemail Caroline left for Thomas where she described me as deteriorating, unstable, a liability. Margaret had a paralegal named Priya whose entire job for those 4 months was building the file. The file got thick. It got thicker. By the end of February, Margaret told me the file had become, in her words, a closing argument. I want to tell you about one specific evening, because it's the one I think about the most. It was in early February. I'd had Aiden and Sophie at the house for the weekend. Caroline had been suspicious about letting them come, but I played the helpless grandfather card, and Thomas had vouched for me. I made the kids pancakes. I took them skating at the rink near the lake. Sophie lost a tooth, and I gave her a $5 bill from the tooth fairy. Aiden told me he wanted to be a marine biologist when he grew up. I told him about the bridges I'd built, and he asked if a bridge could be built over the ocean, and I told him no, but maybe he'd be the engineer who figured out how. He looked at me like I was the most important person in the world after they left Sunday night, after Caroline picked them up and didn't come inside. I sat in the living room with all the lights off, and I cried. Not because I was sad. Because I was angry, because that woman, with her brochure and her tilted head smile and her cousin in real estate, was trying to take something from those children that she didn't even understand. She wasn't just trying to take my money. She was trying to take their grandfather. She was trying to make them grow up believing that their grandfather had been a confused old man who'd needed to be put away. I don't think I'd been truly angry in my whole life until that night. The reading of Eleanor's will was scheduled for the second Tuesday in April at Margaret's office on Bay Street. Caroline had been pushing for it since November, claiming she was concerned about the tax implications of an unsettled estate. The truth was, she wanted the money. She'd already been spending it. I knew because Margaret had quietly subpoenaed the financial records of Caroline's joint account with Thomas that they'd taken out a $180,000 line of credit against the equity of their Forest Hill house in February, and Caroline had been making purchases I didn't understand. A trip to Italy booked for July, a new BMW X5, a down payment on a property in Muskoka that I would later learn was less than 2 kilometers from my own lake house. She thought she was about to inherit it all. The morning of the reading, I put on the navy suit Eleanor had bought me in 2017 for a wedding in Vancouver. I drove myself downtown. I parked in the underground lot at First Canadian Place. I took the elevator up to the 42nd floor. Margaret's secretary, a woman named Diane who had worked there since the Mulroney years, met me at the door and gave me a small, knowing nod. Caroline was already in the conference room when I arrived. She was wearing black. I noticed she'd chosen black. She'd done her makeup carefully. She had a small notebook in front of her and a pen like a student about to take notes. Thomas was beside her. He looked tired. He'd lost weight since the funeral. Caroline's parents were there, which surprised me, sitting against the wall like spectators at a sport. Caroline's father, a man named Douglas who'd retired from a middle management position at Bell Canada in 2009 and never let anyone forget he'd once been in the executive track, gave me the kind of pitying smile that made me want to laugh out loud. I didn't laugh. I shuffled. I let my hand tremble slightly as I pulled out my chair. I asked Diane, with confusion in my voice, if I could have a glass of water. Caroline watched me. She watched me the way a hawk watches a vole. I could feel her doing the math. I could feel her certainty. Margaret came in at exactly 10 o'clock. She had 3 folders with her and a stack of documents, almost as thick as a phone book. She introduced herself to Caroline's parents, who introduced themselves back as if they'd been invited to a cocktail party. She sat down. She poured herself a glass of water. She placed her glasses on the bridge of her nose. And she began. "We are gathered today," Margaret said, "to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Catherine McAllister, late of Toronto, Ontario, executed on the 14th of November, 2024. This is the most recent and binding will superseding all prior testaments. I will read it in full." Caroline leaned forward slightly. I saw her hand reach for Thomas's under the table. Margaret read. The will was, on its surface, exactly what Caroline had been hoping for. Eleanor had left her entire estate, in trust, to be administered for the benefit of those whom I have loved most in this life. Caroline's eyes lit up at "in trust." She didn't yet understand what that meant. She thought "in trust" meant to my family. She thought those whom I have loved most meant her, by extension, by marriage. Margaret kept reading. The trust was to be administered by a single trustee. The trustee, named in the will, was Henry James McAllister, the deceased's husband. The trustee would have full and absolute discretion over distributions of principal and income from the trust during his natural lifetime, and full authority to amend the terms of distribution to beneficiaries as he saw fit, in accordance with provisions Eleanor had laid out in a separate letter of wishes attached as Schedule A. Caroline's face didn't change yet. She still didn't understand. She thought trustee meant manager. She thought my role was administrative. Margaret turned to Schedule A. Schedule A was the letter Eleanor had written in her own handwriting on the 2nd of November, 2024, 4 months before her death. Margaret had transcribed it, but she read aloud from the original, in Eleanor's looping cursive, the same handwriting that had filled the grocery lists on our refrigerator for 40 years. "My dearest Henry," Eleanor had written, "by the time you read this, I will be gone, and you will be the one deciding what becomes of the things my father left me. You and I have talked about this many times in the last few months, though I know you didn't want to. I know you. You wanted to believe everyone would behave well. I know they will not." Caroline went still. Eleanor's letter went on. It was 3 pages. In it she described, with the precision of a woman who'd been a teacher for 31 years and missed nothing, exactly the kind of person Caroline was. She described the way Caroline had treated her during her illness. She described the comments Caroline had made about the lake house at Christmas in 2023. She described the conversation she'd overheard, from her hospital bed, between Caroline and Thomas in the hallway outside her room. In that conversation, Caroline had told my son, "Once your mother's gone, we need to start thinking realistically about your dad. He's not going to last out there alone." Eleanor had heard that she'd been dying, and she'd heard her daughter-in-law plan her husband's removal, and she'd done what Eleanor McAllister always did, which was she'd written it down. Margaret kept reading. The trust, Eleanor had directed, was to be held entirely at my discretion. I could distribute it as I wished. I could distribute none of it if I wished. Upon my death, whatever remained was to be divided as follows: 40% to a scholarship fund Eleanor had established at the University of Toronto for the children of teachers, 40% in trust for our grandchildren, Aidan Henry McAllister and Sophie Eleanor McAllister, accessible at age 30 to be used for education, housing, or the establishment of legitimate businesses, 10 to the Sick Kids Foundation, and 10% to my son Thomas Patrick McAllister, to be released to him only on the express condition, verified by independent counsel, that he was no longer married to or in any partnership, financial or domestic, with one Caroline Eliza McAllister, née Bellingham. The room went silent. Caroline made a sound I will not forget. It was a small sound. A short, hard exhale, like she'd been hit in the stomach. Thomas didn't move. Caroline's mother, against the wall, said, "I'm sorry, what?" Margaret kept her eyes on the document. "I'll read that last clause again," she said calmly. 10% to be released to Thomas Patrick McAllister on the express condition, verified by independent counsel, that he is no longer married to or in any partnership, financial or domestic, with one Caroline Eliza McAllister, née Bellingham. Caroline turned to me. Her face had gone the color of the document. "Henry," she said. Her voice was tight. "Henry, this is some kind of... This can't be." I looked at her. I let my eyes clear. The trembling stopped. The shuffling stopped. The shuffling stopped. The vague, distant look I'd been wearing for 4 months fell off my face like a coat I'd been carrying. "It can," I said. "And it is. Eleanor wrote it. I witnessed it." She stared at me. I watched her understand. I watched the whole architecture of the last 8 months collapse in her face. The brochure, the geriatric specialist, the line of credit, the trip to Italy, the BMW, the property in Muskoka, the conversation she'd had with Thomas in the hospital hallway, which she had not known was overheard. "You," she said. The single syllable came out flat. "Margaret," I said. "Would you continue, please?" Margaret continued. There was, it turned out, a Schedule B. Schedule B was a legal action. While Caroline had been assuming I was unraveling, Margaret had been preparing a civil claim against her, on my behalf, for elder abuse, financial exploitation under Section 331 of the Criminal Code, fraudulent misrepresentation regarding my cognitive state to medical professionals, and breach of fiduciary duty regarding Eleanor's wedding ring, which had been removed from my home without my consent. The claim had been filed with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice the previous Friday. Caroline had been served the morning of the reading. The papers were, at that very moment, in the front pocket of her purse, where the courier had handed them to her in the lobby of the building 20 minutes earlier. She hadn't yet opened the envelope. She'd thought it was related to the will. It wasn't related to the will. It wasn't related to the will. It was the rest of her life. Margaret laid out the case, the medical records, the recorded voicemails, the emails Caroline had sent her cousin in real estate, the line of credit, the unauthorized purchases, the wedding ring. Each piece of evidence Margaret named, she handed across the table in a manila folder. By the time she was done, Caroline had 8 folders in front of her, and she hadn't opened a single one. Thomas finally spoke. "Dad," he said. His voice cracked. "Dad, I didn't know. I didn't know any of. I looked at my son. My only son. The boy I'd taught to skate on the rink at Christie Pitts in 1985. The boy I'd watched graduate from Western in 2010. The man who had, somewhere along the way, traded his backbone for a peaceful marriage and let his wife treat his father like a problem to be solved. Thomas," I said, "I know you didn't know. That's the problem. You should have known. You were married to her. You were her husband, and you weren't paying attention." He started to cry. Quietly, into his hand. "I'm not going to punish you for being weak," I said. "I'm not your mother. Your mother already decided what she wanted. The 10% is there for you, if you ever decide you want it. The 10% is there for you, if you ever decide you want it." I stood up. I picked up my coat. I walked to the door. I turned, at the door, and I looked at Caroline one last time. "You should have just asked," I told her. "You should have just been kind. I would have given you anything. I would have given you everything. You didn't have to take it. You didn't have to plan to take it. You didn't have to plan to take it. All you had to do was love my son and be decent to my wife when she was dying, and treat me like the father of the man you married. That was the whole job. And you couldn't do it." She didn't say anything. There was nothing she could say. I went home that afternoon. I sat in the kitchen where, 4 months earlier, she'd slid the brochure across the table. I made myself a fresh cup of tea. The November frost was long gone. It was April. The light was coming through the window the way Eleanor had always liked it, in long slants across the floor. Caroline was charged in June. She pleaded out in October to a single count of fraud over $5,000 in exchange for the dropping of the elder abuse charge. She received a conditional sentence of 2 years less a day, the first 6 months under house arrest, the rest on probation. She was ordered to repay the $180,000 line of credit she'd taken against the Forest Hill house. The Italy trip was canceled. The BMW was returned. The Muskoka property never happened. Thomas filed for divorce in August. It was finalized the following March. He moved out of the Forest Hill house and into a smaller place in Leslieville. He has the kids every other week. He started seeing a counselor. He calls me every Sunday now. We don't talk about Caroline. We talk about the kids, and about the bridge over the Humber River that he liked when he was young, and about a fishing trip we're planning for the summer up at the lake house. The lake house that was always going to stay mine. Aiden is 11 now. Sophie is 8. They come up to the lake every summer. Sophie has her grandmother's eyes. Aiden, last weekend, asked me again if a bridge could be built across an ocean. I told him I'd been thinking about that question for a year, and I decided the answer was maybe, with the right engineer. He liked that. He's been drawing them on graph paper. He showed me one with 3 different supports and a pedestrian walkway underneath. Eleanor would have loved that. She would have stuck it on the fridge with a magnet shaped like a maple leaf, and she would have kept it there for years, until the paper went yellow, and even then she wouldn't have taken it down. I think about her every day. I think about that night at the lake house, the summer before she got sick, when we sat on the dock, and she told me she was glad we'd had a quiet life. I think about the letter she wrote in November of 2024, when she already knew, when she'd already decided. I think about how she'd seen Caroline more clearly than any of us, and how she'd done what she'd always done, which was protect the people she loved without ever raising her voice. I'm 69 now. I'm not as sharp as I used to be, in real ways, not the pretend ways I performed for that geriatric specialist. My knees are worse. I forget where I put my reading glasses. But I sleep well. I sleep through the night, most nights, and I wake up in a house that is mine, and I drink my tea at a kitchen table that no one is going to take from me. That's the thing about quiet people. We watch, we wait, and when somebody finally pushes too hard, we don't shout, we just open the file we've been keeping, and we let the paper do the talking. Eleanor taught me that. She taught me the whole thing. And I'm grateful, every single morning, that I was paying attention. I've thought a lot, in the months since that morning at Margaret's office, about how Caroline ended up where she ended up. It wasn't one decision. It was hundreds of small ones, each one making the next one easier. The first time she rolled her eyes at Eleanor at Christmas, the first time she suggested I let her handle the mail. The first conversation she had with her cousin in real estate. Each step felt small to her, I'm sure. None of them felt like the moment she crossed a line, but the lines were crossed all the same, one after another, and by the time she sat down at that conference table in April, the road she'd walked down had no exit ramps left. That's what I've come to understand about cause and effect the older I get. Nothing arrives out of nowhere. Caroline didn't lose her marriage, and her freedom, and the life she'd built because of one bad day. She lost it because she'd been planting the seeds of that loss for years, and she'd convinced herself the whole time that the harvest would never come. The same is true the other way around. Eleanor wrote that letter in November of 2024 because of who she'd been every day for 41 years. She'd watched, she'd listened, she'd kept her own counsel. When the moment came that she needed to protect the people she loved, she had the tools to do it, because she'd been quietly building those tools her whole life. The will didn't appear by accident. It appeared because Eleanor had been the kind of person, every single day, who paid attention. I've been trying to teach my grandchildren this without preaching at them, which is harder than it sounds. Aiden asked me last summer, on the dock, why his mother didn't come to the lake anymore. I told him the truth in a version a 10-year-old could carry. I told him that being a good person isn't a feeling you have. It's a thing you do, over and over, in small choices nobody sees, until the choices add up to a life. I told him that the people who treat others kindly when no one's looking are the people who get to sleep peacefully when they're old. I told him his grandmother had been one of those people, and that's why we still talked about her, and why we always would. There's a kind of strength I didn't understand until Eleanor got sick. It isn't loud. It doesn't argue. It doesn't need to win every conversation. It's the strength of someone who knows what they know, who refuses to be rushed, who waits for the right moment and then acts decisively. That's what Eleanor had. That's what Margaret has. That's what, in my own quiet way, I tried to find in myself when Caroline pushed me too far. If I could leave anyone with anything, it would be this. Be honest, even when no one's watching. Use your head, especially when you're being told to ignore it. And when life pushes you, don't shout back. Just remember that paper lasts longer than words, and patience lasts longer than greed, and the people who try to take from you are almost always telling you in advance exactly who they are. Listen to them. Then make your choices.